are you doing innovation? Are you playing innovation? Are you just acting like an innovation leader, or are you actually acting like an intrapreneur who's saying, what are the best results, greatest results I can get for the fewest resources? So if you're lean, if you're focused on that, if you're not just assuming the budgets are always going to be there and spending tons of money on things where you could spend a lot less and get great returns, suddenly you're in this environment and now you can't spend that money and maybe you don't have the muscles to actually operate in a very lean way. So I think, we're seeing that. If you've been used to spending lots of money because you had all those resources and now they're going away and you don't know how to operate when they're not there, you're in a much, you've got a much bigger problem than those who start off very entrepreneurially and say, how would I do this if I were an entrepreneur?
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast. In this podcast, I speak with the world's top experts around what it takes to improve the creativity of your people and their innovation performance. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, award-winning innovation and creativity expert, consultant, keynote speaker, author, and podcast host. Now, let's get on with today's episode. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone around the world. Some of you are joining us live on LinkedIn Live, on YouTube, and on Facebook. Welcome to another live episode of the Idea to Value podcast with your host, me, Nick Skillicorn. And today, two very special guests. We've got Alex Slawsby and Scott Kirsner from InnoLead, Innovation Leader. The reason they're on here today is we've got something very special and very exciting to discuss, hot off the presses, is the latest Innovation Leader report on benchmarking innovation done in conjunction with KPMG USA. I wrote a synopsis of the report yesterday on LinkedIn. It's got some incredibly interesting data for anyone interested in innovation, in driving new ideas in teams, especially leadership level, who might be either supporting or financing innovation teams, because there's some very interesting trends happening this year. First of all, hello, Scott. Hello, Alex. How are you doing?
We're doing great. It's so fun to be on your LinkedIn Live and your podcast. It's very high production values. I love it.
Perfect. Alex, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for having us.
So very quickly, we'll start with Scott, then go to Alex. For people who don't know you, could you just give us a very brief background as to who you are?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a journalist looking at innovation for a little more than 20 years now, writing for publications like Wired and Fast Company, the New York Times, the Boston Globe. I'm interested in innovation in the startup ecosystem, but also innovation in larger companies. And then since about 2013, have been working with Alex and a whole crew of people, mostly here in the US, to build InnoLead, which we describe as the biggest network of corporate innovators and change makers. We're kind of a blend of research company, conference company, and just trying to help corporate innovators level up and make good stuff happen.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I've got about 20 years of experience in different corporate innovation roles. I was an analyst at IDC looking at technology early in my career. I worked for Insight, Clay Christensen's company, helped to lead new growth at Embraer, the Brazilian aerospace company, and been embedded in a wide range of organizations, helping them improve innovation strategy, capabilities, and internal startups, and partner with Scott on all the great stuff we do.
So between the three of us, we've got a pretty good insight as to what's happening in the world of innovation. And as of today, some really useful data to support the discussions that we're going to be talking about today. We are going to be talking about your report called, let me just get the name absolutely right, Benchmarking Innovation Impact 2023. So Scott, Alex, for people who want to download the report, what exactly was the ambition of this report? What sort of things does it go into? And before we start going into the data, what's the sort of target audience for this type of insight?
Well, the target audience, maybe to start with that, because it's the easiest question that you tossed out. Our audience is anybody who works in an established organization in some kind of innovation role. So the audience is global, even though we're based in the US. In innovation roles, right, they might have innovation in the title, but it may be people who have chief digital officer titles or R&D titles, emerging technology design. We look at our community as the people responsible for thinking about the future and making the future happen inside established companies. And generally those are larger companies, it's 500 or 1,000 employees up. We don't really focus on, as you know, Nick, I mean, innovation in startups is a very different thing from innovation in, a 50-year-old company
Absolutely.
that has 50,000 employees. It's just, you're playing a different sport, basically. And this report, like one of the things that we love about it is we've done 3 of these benchmarking reports now. We did, in addition, in 2018, 2020, and now 2023. And so it's really a good chance to ask longitudinal questions about some of the challenges, staffing, reporting relationships, budget, because we're asking some of the same questions, over and over again. And then we also fold in a bunch of new questions about things that we're interested in. Like as an example, in 2022 and 2023, it's like hybrid work versus fully in person, questions about how people are using physical innovation and collaboration spaces. And so, the ambition is just to provide something that's really useful to that audience of people trying to build new stuff in established companies.
Perfect. I really was excited about this discussion because ever since 2018 and your last report came out, it's been one of the best sources of information I've found about how teams in large organizations are actually working on innovation, what types of innovations they're working on, especially from the core, incremental, adjacent, transformational, disruptive innovations, and who's working on these innovations as well. And it's that longitudinal change over time that's been so exciting. So before we get into the detail of the actual report, for those of you who are watching the video, you'll be able to see all of the numbers that we are looking at on screen. Otherwise, if you're listening to the audio version, we'll obviously be quoting everything, but you should be able to download the report as of Tuesday, the 7th of February as well, in order to see all of the data, get a better insight as to what it all means, and be able to use it in your own organization as well.
And we should mention, Nick, that you wrote a really good post, which I think went up yesterday, providing people an overview of the report, kind of a second executive summary that people can find on your LinkedIn feed. So I'm going to plug that for you.
Why, thank you very much. Okay, so before we get into the 2023 report, I think it's worth taking it back to 2018. 2018 was very interesting, looking at what companies were actually working on innovation-wise. Especially one of my favorite data points that you'll hear me talk about in a lot of my client work, which is what a portfolio of innovation actually looks like within companies. There's this sort of common wisdom, as some people might call it, as to what proportion of your innovation budget or effort you should be spending on different types of innovation. And the common numbers that are quoted, going all the way back to, I think it was a 2012 Harvard Business Review article, is about 70% of your effort should be in core, about 20% should be in adjacent, and about 10% should be in transformational work. Now, when InnoLead looked at what companies were actually working on, and you don't need to quote the exact percentages, Scott, unless you know them offhand, you found quite a different sort of proportion as to what innovation portfolios in companies actually looked like. What didn't you?
Yeah, we did. And like, Alex, you should definitely jump in on this stuff, because I think when the 2018 and 2020 reports that we did came out, you were kind of in the trenches, right? Doing innovation at Embraer, I think, in both of those periods. The one thing we should make clear though, Nick, is like when people talk about the mix, there's one mix at the CEO and company level, which might be that 70-20-10 breakdown you talked about. When we do these surveys, we're largely hearing from innovation strategy and R&D people. So they're talking about their portfolio of work. And as you mentioned in the 2018 survey, the breakdown we heard was like about, people said we were doing about 48% incremental work, 26% adjacent, and 26% transformational. But again, that's like the innovation and R&D people talking about their resources and their portfolio of work. But like, Alex, you should definitely take it from there.
Yeah, happy to jump in. So the 70-20-10 is a great starting point, at least to convey the idea that there's multiple types of innovation that are important to help companies get to their growth goals. And you should spend most of your time in the stuff that, keeps the lights on or just moves existing products and services forward. But that 70-20-10 mix, right, depends on industry, depends on the type of company you are, company stages, all these, it depends. But, the challenge we see, of course, is that the transformational stuff, that sort of 10%, Nick, you mentioned in the HBR article, that stuff is really important for the long-term future of most organizations, but it's the toughest thing to sell. And it's the toughest thing to get to a clear, hey, and we've got results story. And so that's where, as you mentioned, as Scott, you mentioned in the 2018 data, there's always this sort of challenge, which is, well, what balance is right for our company, given our industry, given the economy and all of that? And quite often the pressure's on that really big and distant stuff, and folks have a hard time selling it. And so that number generally comes down and tends to be a bit lower than it should be in a lot of, companies who are really seeking to grow and transform and lead over the long run.
What I always find interesting speaking with innovation teams is that transformational work, and to a lesser degree, the adjacent work, is what actually they're most passionate about, though. And there's this conflict that quite often exists between what the company wants and what the innovation teams want to be working on. They want to be doing the really shiny, high technology, future-orientated work, or the type of work that's fundamentally going to change the company, disrupt the company from within. They think that's their duty. And we're going to touch on that a bit later on when we see what the trends are for 2023. But innovation teams get very excited by sort of more longer term transformational work, get a lot less excited by incremental work. But as you mentioned, they also sometimes have a hard time executing and delivering value from this transformational future focused work.
Well, and I'll say real quick, I mean, practically speaking, if innovation teams can't create a lot of confidence that they're at least moving towards moving the needle or getting close to some kind of return on all the resources invested in them, they may not survive for long. And so practically speaking, a lot of teams tasked with adjacent and transformational work, sometimes they need to figure out a way to actually move the core forward a bit and do some of that incremental stuff, which the literature, all the research, the best practices say, oh no, that transformational innovation team, don't touch the core. You're going to get sucked into it. But ultimately, if you're not showing those who are potentially your sponsors, the business units, for example, if you're a centralized function, if you're not showing them value, they may not provide the support that you need. So in fact, here's a situation where the practical sometimes trumps the theoretical. And indeed, if innovation teams want to do that crazy stuff, they may actually need to spend some time just doing the blocking and tackling of core innovation so they can actually buy the time and the space to do that big stuff.
Hey, it's Nick here. If you're enjoying today's episode, I'd really appreciate it if you could show your support by sharing the episode, subscribing on whatever platform you use, whether it's YouTube or your favorite podcast player, and especially if you could leave a review for it in your podcast players like Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever you use. That would really help the algorithm get this episode and all of the previous episodes out to more people and spread the word about what it takes for people to get their best creative performance and improve the success rates of their innovations. Thank you very much. Now, back to today's episode. And I think that is probably the perfect moment to actually go into the data from this year's report. For those of you following us online, you'll be able to see the first slide from the report, which is the breakdown of innovation activities, the change from 2020 to 2023. We're going to talk you through that. And then I think it very, very clearly follows on from what Alex was just saying. If you can't see the screen and if you're just listening to us, the breakdown for the average innovation portfolio in 2020 was about 48% incremental, 26% adjacent, and 26% transformational. So way more transformational and adjacent focused than the 70-20-10 split that's commonly thought of. This has changed significantly for the 2023 report. So in 2023, incremental innovation is jumping up to 53%. Adjacent innovation is jumping slightly, which was a bit of a surprise to me, to 29%. But the real big fall is in transformational innovation, down from 26 to 18%. And I think I'd like to get Scott and Alex's perspectives on what they got as far as feedback from the innovation teams when they're filling out the survey. But from what I'm seeing, the big change which has happened since 2020 to 2023 has been less the pandemic and more the change in the worldwide outlook for the economy, with the war in Russia, the potential of a recession, and the impact that that's having at board levels, where they're thinking about what the focus of the company should be for the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, the key things to maybe shed some light on are the 2020 data is pre-pandemic data. So that survey was conducted in 2019, report published in 2020. The 2023 line that you see on the screen and that you were just talking about is data collected in Q4 of 2022. So as you point out, Nick, there was the war in Ukraine was happening. There was lots of rumbling about, even though the labor market was still tight and unemployment was still pretty low in the UK, the EU, and the US. There was lots of rumbling of recessions. There was definitely a downturn in startup investing by VCs last year. So like I would toss out a couple of hypotheses, and I bet Alex has a few different ones. First is that a lot of the year 2020 and 2021, companies spent in fire drill mode, figuring out how to get their stores and their offices open again, dealing with supply chain snafus. I mean, do you remember that the ship that was stuck in this Suez Canal in 2020? And obviously the COVID shutdown in China and concerns about sourcing from China. And so there's just been a lot of near-term stuff that I think innovation groups have gotten pulled into. I'm actually surprised the number 53% incremental is that low, frankly, given everything
As am I, yeah.
we've been dealing with. And then one or two of my other hypotheses about what's going on with transformational, I mean, it was a booming environment for startup funding in 2020 and 2021 amidst the pandemic. And companies may have just been saying, you know what? Transformational work is going to happen in the startup ecosystem. And we may invest in those startups through our CVC group. We may partner with them and test some of their technologies, but that stuff is better happening off of our balance sheet, and off of our books in the startup world. And there certainly is a lot of it happening. And my last hypothesis is we've been in a really tight talent environment the last couple of years. And if you thought about, Nick, I'm going to make you the chief innovation officer or chief technology officer of Acme Corp, and I need you to staff up a team of AI experts. And you have a headcount of 10. Now go hire those people. Those people were not hireable in the last couple of years. And so, I mean, we know how crazy the job market has been. I bet there's just a lot of unfilled roles in transformational, experimental, emerging technology groups in big companies. That may change a little bit now with all the layoffs we've seen at Amazon and Google and Twitter and lots of other tech
Microsoft and all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't know if you have other hypotheses, Alex, about what's happening with transformational.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would add at a high level for folks who may be tuning in, who are leaders of strategy, innovation, digital R&D, et cetera, in their organizations, is the importance of using data like this to drive a conversation within the organization, which is, what is our mix? What should our mix be? A key component to is definitional. What do we mean when we say incremental, adjacent, transformational? There's a whole separate dialogue we frequently have about horizons and all this language. And it's important to clearly define, what are these things? And then once we've defined them, what's the right, mix? And so I think some organizations define these things differently. And I also think we have conversations, like Scott said earlier, if you're talking to the C-suite, the CXOs, they may have a view for what it should be. If you talk to the innovation teams or the new growth teams, they may have a mix that's a bit different because they're one tool in the toolbox, right? So it's a bigger conversation. Briefly on the transformation point, we're also doing a lot on venture studios and venture builders these days, organizations that have really, existed for a long time, firms that have existed for a long time. Some just help build startups on their own with maybe a corporate as a first customer, but there are ones who actually partner with corporates. Some do it for fee for service, some just for investment off the balance sheet. And they will go build the startup. They'll get the startup team together and they will build it. And so, again, part of the discussion, how much transformational innovation are you doing in-house? You staffing a team, incubating, building those startups on your own. How much of it is that you're actually outsourcing it? And then are you considering doing it like a venture studio or venture builder? And are you considering that as part of your portfolio? So I think Scott nailed all the key points. Big piece here. You got to have that conversation and get that language right, because a lot of organizations don't have the language right and then are not having the right conversation as a result.
Absolutely. I mean, when I'm looking at innovation portfolios with companies, transformational is one of the most interesting words, or some call it disruptive, some call it transformational, because quite often companies internally will feel like they're transforming themselves by doing very low impact projects as far as what's impacting the customer or other people in their ecosystem. And one of my favorite examples is it's happened multiple times that I've spoken with companies where they've got a large IT transformation that they're working on, or a large process transformation that they're working on, and they cite an example of moving from Office to Office 365, or SAP version 3 to SAP version 4. And they think that's transformational innovation, whereas it doesn't actually change the business model very much at all.
Right. And they hire a chief transformation officer, a head of transformation, who oversees, like, what is fundamentally, as you say, like, is an IT evolution project or a tech evolution project. And often that person goes away after 3 years and goes like, all right, my job is done, you know?
Exactly. Transformation achieved.
Right. Transformation achieved. I mean, like, I was going to share a comment just anonymously. You know, one of our members is in, works for a health plan here in the United States. And I was asking him about this, incremental, adjacent, transformational change. And, what he said is, my company wants me to focus on creating innovative things that will bring value to our current business. The things we are doing that others might call transformational or H3 are really just using emerging technologies to innovate in our core business. A good example is using artificial intelligence to make prior insurance authorizations in real time. This is pretty cutting edge, innovative, and industry leading, but it's still our current business and our current market. And so to some extent, these definitions, as Alex was saying, like, you got to get really clear on what you're talking about with each of these categories. And actually, in having this conversation with you two, I sort of feel like maybe we're asking about this the wrong way, because I think innovation teams, this question kind of assumes that you're an innovation team that all they're doing is creating new offerings, new products and services. Yeah. And like, how many of those plug into today's business? How many of them are near term? How many of them are, potentially net new businesses or reaching net new customers? And my belief, I don't know if you guys see this too, is that innovation teams spend a lot of time doing other stuff, like they're running employee idea challenges. They're maybe mentoring with a startup accelerator. They're doing training on design thinking. And like, how would you categorize that stuff? It doesn't really fit into one of these buckets, right?
Absolutely. I wanted to touch on that later on with one of the other sets of slides. So maybe we'll come back to that in a moment. You might be able to see on the screen, or if not, we'll just describe it now, what the report found are the top 10 challenges facing innovators in large organizations. And I don't think we'll go through all of these right now, but I'll just read them out quickly. The top ones are politics, turf wars, and no alignment, which is a major issue for teams trying to innovate. Second one are cultural issues, which I was surprised at it being that high up. Number 3, inability to act on signals or developments critical to the future of the business. Number 4, lack of budget. I mean, that's self-explanatory. If there's no budget, you're not going to be able to innovate. Number 5, lack of strategy or vision. Number 6, lack of executive support, and we'll come back to that point. Number 7, not adopting emerging technologies. Number 8, recruiting not enough, there not being not enough high demand skill sets. Number 9, the inability to pick up on signals or developments critical to the future of the business. And right at the bottom, lack of CEO support. So there's a couple of things to pick out there. First of all, lack of CEO support seems to not be as big an issue as people may have expected, especially with the changing fortunes of the economy. From those top 10 challenges, Scott and Alex, what were your main insights that you saw there?
Do you want to jump in first, Alex?
Yeah, happy to do so. And Nick, I'll just click right on what you said about the CEO support and the executive support. So again, with a lot of the folks we speak with, a lot of the folks in our community, more and more you're getting the CEO who's saying, we've got to do innovation. We've got to grow. We've got to transform. This is important. We can't just do what we're doing today. I mean, they all say the right stuff. And a lot of them, more and more of them, are allocating resources. We need to have people and process and budget and all of that sort of stuff. So the CEO is frequently, supportive, at least saying we need to do this, right? Like yes. Then you see the lack of executive support. That's a little bit higher on the list, right? So then when we talk about executives, we tend to go down a tier or two. And now you've got the folks who actually maybe have to make some trade-off decisions. Do I fund this? Do I fund that? Who do I back? Who do I not back? Do I back up what I say with what I do? Yes, we need to do it, but then I don't show up at the meetings, or I'm the one who's not role modeling the right behavior. So I think CEO goes down the list because a lot of CEOs are saying we need to do it. It's in the annual reports. It's in the investor calls. They're out there. Then you've got the executives a little bit lower down who may be struggling, right, with the priorities and what to back. And I think I'll kind of end my piece here with looking at the top then, the politics, the turf wars, the culture. Now you're getting deeper into the organization. And now you've got that battle for resources, for who's going to get the headlines, for, who's doing the exciting stuff and who's not. I mean, all of those nuts and bolts pieces that we hear all the time from the leaders in our community. How do we collaborate more effectively between innovation teams, business unit teams, and functional teams? And Scott wrote a piece early this year about how innovation, it has to absolutely be a team sport. And if you really don't focus on that team piece across the silos, across the functions in the organization, you're going to go nowhere. And I think that's why we see, 1 and 2 in particular rise to the top.
Yeah, the two things I would highlight real quick are like, you can see that number 3 on the list, inability to act on what's changing in the world, is very high up, is number 3. But the inability to pick up on signals is pretty low down on this list. And so companies are pretty good at sensing what's changing. They talk to customers all the time. They see them at trade shows. They go visit customer sites. So there's an awareness that a new technology is coming or that competitors are introducing a new product. It's just that gearing between the radar dish and, actually doing something about it that is very slow or non-existent. And, the other thing I would point out is like cultural issues is such a big thing that everybody knows, almost every established organization has this cultural, this cultural tension between like being really proud of their heritage and the brand and what they've done in the past. And all that's really good, but knowing that some aspects of it need to change. And so it's like, well, how do you talk about changing that culture in a way where you're not seen as, where you're not seen as too much of a disruptor or, too much of a troublemaker, but like, frankly, there's aspects of it that have to change. So when you look at this list and you see politics, turf wars, culture at the top of it, it like really does highlight how much of this is a diplomacy, psychology, relationship game, not just a, can you build a product? Can you design a service? Can you, create
Absolutely.
a new experience?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd like to back up all of what you said there. Alex, especially what you touched on with the lack of executive support. I just want to highlight that specific one because when I was going through the data behind this list of challenges, you actually ranked them and showed how it changed from 2020 to 2023. What was exceptionally interesting for me is out of these top 10, all of them became less of a challenge from 20 to 2023, except for lack of executive support, which actually rose. And when I combined that with looking at one of the slides we'll come on to next, which is a change in the budgets available for innovation and innovation teams, these executives are usually the ones who hold the budgets because they are the ones who ultimately have the line items below them, or the departments, the service lines, whatever you call them in your company. And if they are the ones who are ultimately responsible for delivering, quite often the executives, the senior vice presidents, the directors, the managing directors, whatever they might be called at your companies, those are often the people who are more focused on the operational aspects of the business than the CEO is, and therefore also more afraid of the negative impacts of things going wrong than the CEO is, because it's their head and their teams on the line. So it's really interesting seeing lack of executive support actually rising this year.
And Nick, I'll just make one, if I could, just one final comment on that. If you think about it, if you're a senior leader in an organization, unless you've come in relatively recently due to an acquisition or some other move, you've risen to prominence because you've made the business as it is today successful. So you're now at that VP, SVP, XVP level. You may not have a lot of incentives to upset the apple cart for you or for others. So yes, innovation is great. Innovation's great. But if I'm going to endorse something that pushes the company in a direction that I can't lead, in which I can't lead it, maybe not. So back to, Scott's point about diplomacy and psychology and individual leaders. Frequently, the incentives are not aligned for individual leaders between what's good for them and what's good for the company. And that may be a reason why some of this stuff rises to the top.
Absolutely. We've got the next slide up now, which ironically is the polar opposite. It's the top 10 enablers of innovation success. And those are from the biggest enabler to the least strong enabler. Number one, leadership support. What did we literally just talk about? If you have leaders supporting the initiatives, then that's going to enable you. Number two, the ability to test, learn, and iterate. Number three, the right team, types of employees. Number four, the right strategy and vision. Number five, the right approach and tactics. Number six, the right level of funding and budget. Number seven, the organization accepting failure well. And the number eight, having the correct technology and infrastructure. What I found very interesting is those are essentially, in many cases, the flipped opposites of the challenges that we saw. Scott, Alex, I don't know in how much detail you went into the difference between the two, but were you seeing some companies where a lack of one of these capabilities was causing it to be a challenge, and where it did exist, it was actually an enabler?
Oh, it's such a good question, Nick. I mean, this, like the two things that I find are just interesting about this list are, number two, being able to test, learn, and iterate, to me is like synonymous with actually we're doing stuff, we're running experiments. A lot of these initiatives wind up just being PR, culture, training. And, not that that's a bad thing, but, you often see people going a year or two of just taking meetings or running events at their company before they've actually started experimenting with stuff that customers see. And so I think that's one highlight of the enabler of success, is that you're experimenting, learning, pivoting. And then I just think there's always so much focus on the word failure and, oh, we need to accept failure and celebrate failure, and failure isn't a bad thing. And you see that pretty low down on this list. Most organizations don't like the word failure. No matter what they say, having failures on your resume does not tend to rocket you up the executive ranks, to the C-suite. And so to me, that's interesting. That being able to accept failure is not number one as a cultural trait, because I think most companies, if they're honest, they're like, yeah, you can fail here and there, but when you have a $10 million, $100 million failure on your resume, it's not a great thing for your career internally.
If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably interested in creativity and innovation. Well, I help companies, government agencies, individuals, startups, and rapidly growing companies successfully deliver more innovation projects at a higher value and improve the creativity of the people they have, using my consulting, keynote speeches, workshops, and online courses. If you'd like to find out how I might be able to help you and your team, then click the link below to get in contact with me at my website, www.improvides.com, where you can find out about all my services and testimonials from thrilled clients. I look forward to hearing from you soon. Now, back to the episode. Now, as far as these teams having the ability to work effectively and actually get things done, you also did some research into how innovation teams are collaborating this year. So what we saw is about 13% are working completely virtually, remotely. Just under 6% are working completely in person. And nearly 82% of teams are working in a hybrid model, where some people are in teams, some virtual, probably depending on the week, the day, what the, activities the project needs. I found this really interesting, not only for how high the hybrid system is, but also the fact that innovation teams seem to be the perfect guinea pigs for this to work. Scott and Alex, what did you find from this insight?
Well, I mean, one we found in some of our qualitative interviews, even companies where they have actual R&D labs where people are doing, chemistry and engineering, like Kimberly-Clark, the CPG company, even they are saying, look, it's not a 40-hour a week, 5 days a week in the office job anymore. You need to give people flexibility, and they've acknowledged that there's some roles that you can do perfectly well working at home. Obviously not lab bench types of tasks, but plenty of like data analysis, right? That can be your, Thursday and Friday at home work. And then also, there's been so much griping about productivity, and like particularly CEOs that you see quoted in the Economist or the Wall Street Journal complaining about the work from home, lack of productivity. Most of these innovation folks, when you ask them about how productive their team is, largely feel it's either the same or more productive now. And, we should point out that the respondents to this survey are predominantly director level, VP level, and up. So these are not like the worker bee frontline scientists all saying we love the flexibility to work at home. Like this is directors, VPs, EVPs saying, you know what, we're making hybrid work for us.
There was a fascinating piece of research coming out from Microsoft a couple of months ago, which looked at tens of thousands of workers. And they found that, apologies if I get the exact figures wrong, but about 85% of employees felt they were just as productive working remotely. But 88% of managers did not feel like their teams were being productive. And it's this difference of perspective, not only of what a team should be doing, but what they should be measured on as well. So I wrote an article about what the purpose of a manager is nowadays anyway. And it's really interesting to think about what did managers used to do. They tried to show that they were doing management and that involves them being active. And they usually thought they needed to do that by being around the people that they were trying to manage. And now a lot of managers are having this crisis of identity of what should I actually be doing? How can I show that I'm adding value when my team seems to be doing fine in many cases when I'm not around?
Well, and Nick, I wonder if this gets to the challenge, which has been recognized for years about, hierarchical leadership. I mean, this is not top down, right? I mean, servant leadership is people generally say, it's about the team working together. It's about flattening the hierarchy, which I think works in a lot of situations. I think a lot of employees want that, right? They want sort of managers and leaders as colleagues, right? Not as those that enforce. And so I think managers that still exist in a bit of that hierarchy, my team it's my team, and I'm responsible for my team, and the team needs to do what, I want them to do. Again, struggle in an environment where the team isn't sitting right there with them, and the team is off working, but there isn't that clarity, as you say. So again, managers who buy into this whole democratization of leadership, that sort of are more part of their team than directing the team, I think they see this a bit differently. So again, another thing that encourages management and leadership to evolve for a hybrid world.
Just before we go on from this topic, the fact is it's still hybrid. So there is still times when the team members are seeing value to come in and work in a physical location. What types of work are you seeing being the big drivers for people still wanting to be face-to-face with each other?
I mean, I think largely it's, it's prototyping stuff. It's to some extent ideating. I mean, there definitely are people who feel differently. There's some people who feel like Mural or Moreau, and ideating in an online platform is a much more level playing field. There are just still people, maybe they're all extroverts, who feel like the energy of like drinking a couple cups of tea or coffee and having some donuts with people just, creates the sugar and caffeine high, and good ideas emerge from that in a way that they don't when you're on a desktop with Moreau. And so I think some of the ideating, and definitely just the prototyping, the paper prototyping, the making physical products, putting them in front of customers. There's still some of that, some of that activity. I also think the getting people back in person for training, if part of the innovation team work is training, there's a fair amount of skepticism of like, is an hour of training online as good as an hour in person when you can break people up and have, activities and hands-on learning. I don't know what you might counter some of that, Alex, because there's certainly plenty of pluses for doing stuff digitally.
No, if I can just echo one thing, I mean, we've been talking, through this discussion on some of the data that says, look, it's about diplomacy, right? It's about building relationships. It's about navigating politics. It's creating alignment, getting through culture. These are very human things that require trust, require collaboration, require people to be on the same page. That's hard to do over Zoom. It's hard if you're purely remote to build those trusting relationships with somebody that indeed you may need in the end to endorse what you're doing, give you resources, support you. And so that's a vote to say, yeah, a lot of stuff can be done digitally, but because some of the biggest, accelerators and inhibitors of innovation around personal relationships, there is a case to be made that innovation teams and leaders, do need to get in the same room as those folks with whom they're collaborating and those folks they need support from, and build that trust that then can exist when you're on Zoom. But if you don't have that in the first place, how are you going to sell that challenging, complex initiative? So that's a bit of a vote for making sure there is some in-person time, because I don't know how you navigate politics without it.
So that falls on nicely to the next topic, which is about people actually working in innovation teams. We'll go through this reasonably quickly because there's one slide which is around how long it usually takes to fill team roles. It almost always takes between 1 and 3 months or 3 and 6 months. So that makes up nearly 70% of the time taken to fill roles. Within 6 months, it seems like teams should be able to find resources. And that follows on nicely to the expectations about how these innovation team sizes are going to change. So sort of related to the types of transformational, incremental, adjacent work and the budgets available to teams. What's interesting is if you look at whether teams are going to increase dramatically, somewhat, remain stable, decrease somewhat, or decrease dramatically, remaining stable is the overwhelming favorite this year, with 43% of teams saying they're likely to remain stable. Just under 40% think that they're going to increase somewhat, but very, very few teams think they're going to increase dramatically. And about 10% of teams think they're going to decrease somewhat. 4% think they're going to decrease dramatically. So this is, compared to previous years, maybe a sign that teams are less excited about their prospects of what budget they're going to have available. Teams, sorry, Alex and Scott, what are you seeing as far as the drive towards what's happening with innovation teams is?
The only thing to say about questions like this is, to quote Monty Python, who brilliantly said, "No one expects the Spanish Inquisition." Like you ask somebody a question about budget or team size, and they're like, it's kind of a gut check question, even if the people are a VP or an SVP. There's some bullishness, and we definitely do see a lot of teams that are still newly formed and adding roles. Like we have a pretty active job board where people post open roles. It's a great comment that you brought up on the screen about, managers and their team members are new to remote working style, and let's give them leverage for learning this new management style.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Alex or Nick, because I do feel like anyone who managed in the pre-pandemic era just does feel like, man, if I have an employee that I only interact with on Zoom, that's just a challenging way to have like a positive influence on that person, and really, like Alex was saying, build trust and build a relationship just in 2 dimensions.
Yeah, I'll just say real quick, I think, to echo, Scott, what you said, in this data here, particularly if you're working on adjacent innovation, building new things for existing customers, or transformational, building really new things, lots of ambiguity, lots of sales, lots of navigating complexity and change. You got to find people who are comfortable with doing that and taking some risks. There's this whole, obviously, profile depending on what type of innovation you're pursuing, and those who can be collaborative remotely, and those who can have influence in the sensitive way, all these sorts of things. So I think there is growing recognition that these people are hard to find, and if you found people that can operate in your environment successfully, if you happen to let them go, you may never get them back, or it's going to take a long time to get them back. So while budgets may be under pressure, well, we may not be spending what we thought we would. you get rid of those team members and you may be setting yourself back years. And I think that's what this data shows.
So it's the expected innovation budget growth between 2020 and 2023. And for those of you who are interested as to how innovation budgets are changing, in 2020, around 14% of companies thought they were going to significantly increase the budget this year. 40% were going to increase it somewhat. Less than a quarter were going to remain the same. And less than 6% were going to decrease their budget. Now in 2023, that has changed significantly. Increase significantly has dropped by a factor of 3, so down to 5%. Increase somewhat has also dropped. Remain the same is the most popular option, with about a third of companies doing that, but decreasing has jumped significantly up to a total of about 26%. And I think this feeds back into what we talked about as far as the types of innovations, the makeup of the portfolio, what the teams are likely to look like. And there's just a whole multitude of considerations that not only the innovation teams need to think about, but also what the management needs to think about. So I wanted to ask one specific thing here, Alex and Scott, because we're slowly coming up to the end of time. From what we're seeing here, with teams potentially having to deal with either no additional budget or less budget, are there going to be innovation teams that are effectively caught out with their pants down for not delivering actual impact? Because a lot of innovation teams think that their purpose is growth, and their purpose, as you said previously, was doing training seminars or design thinking, or holding meetings or discussions. But now with expectation of delivery and having fewer resources to do it, what are you seeing as far as what these teams might expect and experience in 2023?
You know, Alex, you'll have to refresh my memory of like how this conversation came up, but someone was asking a question in one of our recent online events about, you know, like, what's the best way to kind of, in a cash efficient way, solve X problem or do X? I forget if it was like startup scouting or something. Do you remember that conversation I'm talking about?
Not specifically, but certainly a number of conversations like that, because efficiency, I mean, so one thing I'll say, I mean, obviously efficiency is crucial. Not a lot of innovation leaders actually act like intrapreneurs. So that's a really interesting, Nick, we could have a much broader conversation about it. Are you doing innovation? Are you playing innovation? Are you just acting like an innovation leader, or are you actually acting like an intrapreneur who's saying, what are the best results, greatest results I can get for the fewest resources? So if you're lean, if you're focused on that, if you're not just assuming the budgets are always going to be there and spending tons of money on things where you could spend a lot less and get great returns, suddenly you're in this environment and now you can't spend that money and maybe you don't have the muscles to actually operate in a very lean way. So I think, you know, we're seeing that. If you've been used to spending lots of money because you had all those resources and now they're going away and you don't know how to operate when they're not there, you're in a much, you've got a much bigger problem than those who start off very entrepreneurially and say, how would I do this if I were an entrepreneur? Better situation for those.
Yeah, and I think there's a whole panoply of tools, you know, like the low code, no code tools, you know, lots of great wireframing and kind of digital prototyping and 3D printing, where like you really can shape ideas and put them in front of customers in a pretty cash efficient way. But I also think like there's some good news in this budget tightness, which means to me that like companies are going to be leaning on external consultants and contractors a little bit more in 2023 if they're not confident enough in their own headcount growth and their own overall budget growth. And I also just think that, you know, one thing Alex mentioned before, the world of venture studios and kind of creating startups externally, you know, some of those venture studios have venture funds attached to them where it's like, hey, they're going to take $1 million of capital. You're going to take $1 million of capital, put them together with a great concept and some knowledge of the customers and knowledge of the market. And let's create something new that's going to live like a real startup as opposed to a, you know, internal startup at the company where you're funding the whole thing. And so it's definitely a year for people to be really creative. And I think also to think, just to level up, just something we haven't touched on, talking about vision and storytelling and like the reason why we're doing all this stuff, like, innovation is not a utility like the lights where you have to pay the electric bill every month or someone turns out the lights. It's very easy to turn this stuff off, And so like that really puts the pressure on these innovation people and teams. And like, it's part of the reason why we exist at InnoLead, right? Is to help keep the lights on, help companies invest more in innovation. And so I just think vision, storytelling, creating that sense of urgency of like, here's why we're investing in this stuff, not just because it's great to put out press releases and have the CEO say the word innovation in an earnings call. It has to be more compelling and more concrete than that.
I agree completely. I think that this is the year where a lot of innovation teams are going to prove their value. And they're going to do that because if they don't, the alternative is quite a negative potential for them. I do think, unfortunately, this is likely to be a year of pruning for people who are not delivering. So teams who may be talking about transformational innovation, but not actually validating that they're making much progress will be hardest hit. And it might be that, like with any economic cycle, this is a regular occurrence that needs to happen, where it's a good opportunity for not only companies, but innovation teams to take a good hard look at their portfolio and say, okay, if we really want to make an impact, then our focus should be on this and this. And it might be uncomfortable for some team members because it's not necessarily the skill set or the passion that they're most familiar with, but it's what is the right thing to do. So I think there's some teams which will get creative and really thrive as a result of what's coming our way. Other teams will struggle a lot more. Other teams might not survive at all, but it's something necessary. And at the end of it, I think the companies will be stronger for it.
I totally agree. But I also think, not just a pruning year, but like AI, I think is not overhyped, right? Like this is going to change a lot for a lot of companies. And, potentially beyond AI, there's other technologies, as quantum computing matures, right? Like that's going to be a big deal for a lot of industries. And so, I do think it's a year of like, as you say, it's where the rubber meets the road. You have to be delivering value. But some of what we're seeing with AI, from really simple robotic process automation to the really complex generative stuff, like figuring out how to leverage that, I think is going to be a real differential between winners and losers, and that's the topic for a whole other LinkedIn Live. But, so I would say it's not just a year of pruning, it's a year of like finding ways to get competitive advantage out of this really fast maturing new technology.
Perfect. Scott, Alex, I think that's the most important points from the report. What would you say is the best way for people to either find out more? Where should they go? What sort of things should they be considering?
I was going to point up, like, our emails are almost on the screen. You can email Alex at InnoLead or Scott at InnoLead. You can never figure out how to point the right way on cameras nowadays. Our website is innolead.com. And then your LinkedIn post, which provides a really nice overview of the report, is also a great read.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Alex, Scott, it's been wonderful having you here. I always enjoy our conversations, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.
Hey, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please show your support by sharing the episode and leaving a review. And if you'd like me to come and speak with you about what it might take to improve the creativity of your people and the innovation performance of your projects, then go to www.improvides.com. Get in contact with me and let's see how we might work together in the future. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.